Poisoned by Putin, the widow of Alexei Navalny is convinced her husband was killed and isn't afraid to say it. She's now vowed to continue his work. Could we be looking at the new face of Russia's opposition? Yulia Navalnaya is already building support inside the EU and today had this message for Russians at home.
I ask you to share with me the rage, anger, hatred towards those who dared to kill our future.
She's demanding a free Russia, but is that possible under Vladimir Putin? And could upcoming elections make him even stronger? A senior Democrat shares her fears.
There are those in the Congress, sad to say, who have been supportive of Putin because he who shall remain nameless has been supportive of Putin.
Plenty more from Nancy Pelosi on Trump, Putin and the Middle East throughout the program. We'll also be sitting down with the Foreign Minister of Egypt. He tells me more needs to be done to avert a wider conflict beyond Gaza. And after 58 years in film, Jodie Foster on how her industry has changed since her first appearance on screen.
I never saw another woman, for example. And now, really just recently for the United States, women directors. That was the last bastion of change. And everybody's happier.
Good evening. Since Friday, there has been countless eulogies written about Alexei Navalny. At times, it felt like the entire democratic world was grieving the death of Vladimir Putin's most vocal critic. And yet, while tributes flooded in, something else was happening. Navalny's widow was getting to work. Yulia Navalnaya was adamant her late husband's death shouldn't be in vain. Today, she issued a statement claiming Navalny was poisoned and demanding the return of his body. She's vowed to continue his work and called on people at home to back their efforts to create a free Russia. Meetings with EU leaders followed as she tried to build up support for a new campaign against the Kremlin. So here's a question. Could we now be looking at the new face of Russia's opposition? If we are, then how does she challenge Putin's authority from abroad? In a moment, we'll hear why elections at home and the United States could make Putin stronger than ever before. I'll be getting the thoughts of senior Democrat Nancy Pelosi. First, though, here's our main report from our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magnay.
Yulia Navalnaya had always played the supporting role to her husband. He would rarely meet with Western leaders, but from exile and to avenge his death, she must. And now, just 4 days a widow, but with an extraordinary poise and steeliness, she has released this video message swearing to continue his fight.
I urge you to stand with me, to share not only the grief and endless pain that has confused us and will not let go. I ask you to share with me the rage, anger, hatred towards those who dared to kill our future.
Even as Navalny's mother, Ludmila, traipsed the frozen streets of Salakard in Russia's far north, demanding to see her son's body, which authorities say will not happen for at least another 2 weeks, Yulia promised to expose what had happened to him.
They are now hiding his body, not showing it to his mother, not giving it to them, but lying and waiting pathetically for the traces of another of Putin's Novichoks to disappear.
Scraps of evidence so far, live camera footage of an unusual nighttime convoy travelling the road between the Karp penal colony and the local morgue. In the middle, a truck belonging to Russia's prison service, with traffic police cars on either side. The Kremlin says the release of the body to the family has nothing to do with them, and that comments from global leaders that Vladimir Putin is responsible for Alexei Navalny's death won't hurt him and are unbecoming of them. But if they'd wanted Alexei Navalny's message to somehow die along with him, they hadn't reckoned on the resilience of his wife. Navalnaya's challenge is to unite a divided opposition, most of whom are now in exile, and to rally Navalny's frightened support base in Russia.
Without the participation of...
But other exiled activists say the West must play its role.
We deserve a platform, we deserve a voice. All we need, and we have this voice, all we need is for the West to actually listen to us, to listen to our concerns, to listen what we have to say, to provide us platform and, in some cases, shelter in the Western countries.
Yulia Navalnaya fought to save her husband when he was poisoned. She nursed him back to health and kissed him goodbye on Russian soil with no illusions as to his likely fate. Now she takes on the fight of her life with a force that the Kremlin's cruelty towards her family and her country has helped create.
Well, Diana joins me live now from Moscow. Diana, good to see you. Yulia Navalnaya really hasn't wasted any time. I guess the question is, how effective can she be, especially if she does operate from abroad?
Well, this is the trouble. You know, I remember interviewing here Vladimir Kara-Murza, who is now serving a 25-year sentence on treason charges. He was is a British Russian dual national. And he said to me here about Alexei Navalny and about himself, you know, a Russian politician cannot not be in Russia. That would be the biggest gift that we would give to Vladimir Putin if we weren't here. And I think that was his ethos. That was Ilya Yashin's ethos, another key opposition member who's currently serving a long sentence. That was how Alexei Navalny felt, and look what happened to him. And so her only choice is to operate from abroad. But then you do, of course, lose the power or the authority to tell people in this country to take considerable risks, possibly ending up in jail by going out on the streets and defying Vladimir Putin from the relative comfort, and I'm sure she'll have to have security, of abroad. It is a very difficult role to play, I think. I think people here understand that she can't come back. I think what she does represent is hope. After Alexei Navalny's death, because he was such a charismatic figure. He was the only one that people could believe in. And I think she has that moral courage, that authority, that strength after everything that she's been through, that she really exhibited today. And I think does provide people at least with that hope that there is still something, a symbol of something worth fighting for, of a better future. But how much she can really change things, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I mean, you were reporting all weekend on the crackdown on those who were putting out flowers and coming out in tribute to Alexei Navalny. And, you know, you said they can put flowers out, but they can't actually hold up any placards. Just tell us a little bit more about how this is being covered in Russia.
So on Russian state TV, you don't get very much mention of Alexei Navalny, and that has always been the case. You have never seen sort of rolling video of Navalny. You've never seen his protests on state TV. So those people who don't have much inkling about him just think the way the Kremlin wants them to think about him, i.e. that he was a Western stooge, he was placed here by the FBI, and they should have no truck or no faith in him. And that is why he really stood as a figurehead just for the liberal opposition in this country. And we did see tens of thousands come to the streets. But I think that the fact that he was never really shown on state TV was a really big part of that. And so that is mirrored now. But in some of the newspapers, you are seeing a little more coverage. But again, it's the independent media mostly operating from abroad who are taking this story further, who are talking about where his body is, who are broadcasting what's happened to Yulia Navalnaya and what she's fighting for. And for a lot of that, you have to get at it through VPNs. So a lot of this information is not readily accessible to your average Russian who is not necessarily going out to look for what happened to Navalny or what his wife might do next.
Diana, thank you as always for all of your reporting. Now, in a moment, we'll be getting the thoughts of tonight's studio guests. Joining me here is journalist and filmmaker Dr. Miriam Francois and Danielle Sheridan, defence editor at The Telegraph. But before that, I just want to bring you part of my interview with Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the US House of Representatives. She told me Vladimir Putin was, quote, evil and raised concerns about Donald Trump's potential return to the White House. She also had strong words for Republicans threatening to hold up funding for Ukraine. You'll remember Alexei Navalny was punished for taking a stand against the war. Pelosi was keen to pay tribute to his life and legacy. Have a listen.
The assassination of Alexei Navalny is a terrible thing to happen, especially a calculated assassination timed to coincide with a Munich Security Conference. I don't think there's any doubt that the timing was calculated that way. For a day, his widow, now widow, Julia, she was saying, I don't believe it, I don't know that it's really true, but then today she confirmed it, and it's a source of great sadness to all of us, his courage. So we see everything as an opportunity. Hopefully this will call attention to the evilness that is Putin, and shed a little more concern on what he's capable of, on other prisoners that are there, and give us an opportunity to try to get them released, but at the same time garner even more support for the people of Ukraine.
What would you say to Vladimir Putin?
To Vladimir Putin, I would say what I ask other people. Is he sick? Is he crazy? And the answer I get back is no, he's just a very evil person. Think of the children. He doesn't think of the children, not the children of Russia or Ukraine or any other place. But I'm always worried about the children. Clearly he is not.
What do you think the United States now needs to do?
I think we should continue to do what we're doing to enthusiastically support the people of Ukraine, admiring their courage, their just determination to save their democracy, and in doing so, they're saving everyone's, including ours. So I anticipate that when we go back, we will find a path to send the money for security to Ukraine. And then I would hope that there would be a recognition that even when Ukraine wins this war, which they must, and we must help them do so, that if Putin's still around, Russia will still have to be dealt with, and so we have to be prepared.
You're a master tactician of Congress. You know, how can House Dems help force the issue of the bill being blocked and the aid money to Ukraine currently being held up?
You have to understand that in the House of Representatives, in a very strong bipartisan way, over 300 votes would be there, and you only need 218 to pass the legislation. So we just have 4 words: give us a vote, give us a vote. But we will at the same time examine other parliamentary tactics that give us leverage in the appeal to give us a vote. It's shameful. This is really shameful. Every day that goes by that we don't have this assistance there, people will die. And as we were hearing today, if you lose land, you get it back, but when people die, you can't get them back.
And yet the issue is being politicized.
Well, there are those in the Congress, sad to say, who have been supportive of Putin because he who shall remain nameless has been supportive of Putin.
Europeans here are worried. They see America and they say America is stepping back. You've dealt with Donald Trump. What advice would you give them?
Him? Have an intervention into your mental health, your political viability. He's really grotesque, and it's really a shame. And I never talk politics when I go overseas, because that's just the way we have always. We've been very bipartisan when we go overseas. We may have our differences, and we criticize the president at home, and that I might hesitation to do that. But he has ventured into the global scene by his chumminess with Putin, his practically giving a green light to the Republicans in Congress to hold up this funding for the war, so that we can have a victory sooner with fewer lives lost on either side. So it's no use talking to him, because he is just in a world of his own, a puppeteer who's not only being a puppeteer, but shining the light on the strings of these puppets who are the House Republicans.
What advice would you give to the Europeans on how to deal with him?
I would say to them what I've said to some of them today. The plural of anecdote is not data. That's an expression we use in the Appropriations Committee. Just because he says things and then people say, oh, he could win or this or that. Don't agonize, organize. That's what we say ourselves when we have to win the election. So I think it's a strain on them to be worrying about something that may never happen. I mean, he won once, so people say we could win again. I don't think that that's so. But in the meantime, the more he speaks out, the more clearly we understand what his motivation is. And that's an opportunity, too.
That was Nancy Pelosi, and we'll be hearing more from Nancy Pelosi throughout the programme. She'll also be speaking about the situation in the Middle East. Let me bring our panellists back in. Dr. Miriam Francois, journalist and filmmaker, and Danielle Sheridan, defence editor at The Telegraph. Danielle, I'll begin with you. I mean, I was at the Munich Security Conference where I spoke to Nancy Pelosi over the weekend, and throughout the first day, there was a lot of discussion around what the West would do about Alexei Navalny's death, and it doesn't feel like they have much in their toolbox at this stage.
I completely agree. I mean, we heard Biden say that he would have an enormous response. We've seen Boris Johnson come out, Rishi Sunak come out, David Cameron come out, all condemning this horrific act. However, what can they do other than impose more sanctions? And sanctions
if there aren't any sanctions really left.
Exactly. And sanctions have proven meaningless. The whole reason that sanctions were imposed on Putin when he launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine was to deter him, and that failed. So it kind of feels like quite a meaningless word, really. And I've been, talking to senior sources myself since the death of Navalny was announced, and people don't really know what our government, let alone the US government, is going to do in response. But as I said, this idea of sanctions seems quite empty.
A lot of words like concern and condemnation, but is there going to be any real action, is the question.
Well, I have to start by saying the chutzpah of Nancy Pelosi coming on TV and saying, the children, sure, just the Ukrainian ones? We just forget about the 13,000 ones in Gaza, presumably, please. I think, look, Navalny is a figure. He will long outlive the short but meaningful life that he had as a figure of the opposition, as a symbol of resistance to autocratic regimes, to authoritarianism, which is creeping around the world, right? We are seeing the emergence of these strongmen regimes, not just in Russia, but now increasingly in the US. And also here in the UK, we're seeing a serious erosion of civil liberties, of people's abilities to protest. And I think that really, if there's a lesson to take from Navalny's death, it really is that we have to reinforce the framework of international law, which is the only framework which internationally guarantees something we can each hold each other accountable to. Without that framework, we literally have what's just happened. You don't like who's in opposition, they just disappear. It's a dangerous example to set, but it's also important that our riposte is one that highlights what we think should be the framework and not the opposite, which is the erosion of the very framework that we should be holding people to, including ourselves.
I mean, what's interesting about Navalny is that he was a Russian patriot. He was a nationalist. Mm-hmm. And that is in many ways perhaps why Putin feared him most.
The closer you are to power, even in how you represent yourself, the greater the risk. But I mean, I think ultimately this is a question of within any political system, we need to be able to express dissent. At least some form of dissent has to be allowed. What we're seeing, obviously, in Russia is, 20,000 people being imprisoned for, very low levels of dissent. I don't think that the response to that is to mirror these hard men regimes. I think the response to that is to say, actually, we're going to make sure you can see that we have open societies, that we're going to allow that space for everyone to be heard.
Well, we don't send people off to penal colonies in Siberia. Yeah, we still have rules of, rule of law.
We do, yeah. I mean, we are a democratic nation, and the issue is that we are dealing with someone who is irrational and pretty much behaves like a psychopath. He's tried to murder people on British soil. Russians frequently fall out of windows. I mean, he operates an a terrible, murderous regime. And I agree that there should be some sort of international system that makes Putin, abide by the law. But I think that will never happen. And
whether he would abide by those.
And he won't, because it's a pattern of behaviour. He's shown again and again that he can murder people and get away with it. And as you said, Navalny, he feared him so much because he did believe in Russia. He loved Russia. And that is why he went back into that country knowing it would be the death of him.
He wouldn't meet with Western leaders. I mean, as much as people sort of want to describe him as some kind of Western puppet, he wouldn't meet with Western officials who were desperate to meet with him. We do have to move to the next segment, so we'll keep you right here. But you're watching The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Still to come, Israel's Ramadan threat. We'll have the latest from Gaza as a ground offensive on the border city of Rafah looks increasingly likely. Plus, the brain disease raising questions about one of the world's most popular sports. We investigate whether there's a link to head injuries and violent crime.
Yes, so this Saturday we're planning a mass trespass to a place called Vixentor on Dartmoor. And near to Vixentor is an example of an access island. And an access island is a place where the public have a right to roam, but have to trespass to get there. And this rather absurd situation goes really to the heart of why England's access laws are broken. 20 years ago, the Countryside and Rights of Way Act gave the public a right to roam over England, but only over a partial area of England, only 8% of the country. And to some very remote and fragmented locations, parts of moorland, mountain and downland and places like that. Places that are very remote from where most people live, but also these habitats have become very fragmented through degradation over the centuries. And that's given us a very fragmented system of access as well. So what we're really calling for is for politicians to change the law in England to give the public something much more similar to what the public in Scotland have enjoyed over the last 20 years, which is a full right of responsible access to the majority of land and water in the countryside. Well, Vixentor has a long history of access disputes. When the current landowner bought it 20 years ago, they closed off access. It's known as the Forbidden Tor on Dartmoor. But it's really only an example of 2,500 islands, access islands, that the Right to Roam campaign has calculated exists across England. So we think it's really important that the public do have a right to access these places, but unfortunately, we have to trespass to get to them. So that's why we're organising a mass trespass this Saturday, to which over 500 people so far have currently signed up.
Welcome back. American football, it's a sport we're all familiar with, but wouldn't necessarily link with violent crime. Scientists in the US are trying to establish whether there is a connection between violent behaviour and a brain disease called CTE. The condition has been linked to repeated head injuries and is now under the spotlight after numerous incidents of violence in ex-players. A warning: this report from our US correspondent Martha Kellner contains graphic content, including brain dissection, as well as some flashing images.
Police say former NFL player Philip Adams shot and killed.
Police say a suspect, 25-year-old Noah Green, drove into two Capitol police officers.
They're some of the most notorious crimes of recent times that seem to have little to do with the world of American football. But as a country grasps for answers, why and how could they do this? Some believe clues do lie here, in head injuries sustained years before they ever committed such awful acts.
This brain is from a person who played football in his youth, had a few concussions.
Chronic traumatic encephalopathy, more commonly known as CTE, is a brain disease which can affect people who play contact sport.
An unflattering spotlight on America's favorite sport.
The long-term dangers of all those hard hits to the head.
It's caused by repeated blows to the head, but it doesn't just affect professionals. Maisie is the mother of Noah Green, a former high school star.
Noah said it got worse after that skull fracture and the concussions.
Noah suffered repeated head injuries on the field. Speaking publicly for the first time, Maisie says she started to notice his personality changing as the years went by.
There you go, get on up. He would start wearing blankets around his head. And I just thought, it was like a teenage thing. And then after that, it was like he started these bad headaches, real bad headaches. He's like, I don't know what's wrong with me. He's like, I've got to get out of the country. They're going to kill me. I was like, who's like the FBI? They're going to kill me. They're doing me wrong, Mom.
It was paranoia.
Yeah.
That paranoia met a fatal end when 25-year-old Noah crashed his car into a barricade at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., killing Officer William Evans and lunging at others with a knife before police shot him dead. Shannon Terranova, the mother of Officer William Evans' two young children, told Sky News, "I want to be mindful of all who were impacted by this real-life horror, but it's difficult for me to comprehend any rationalisation of what happened to Billy and the events that led up to his death. Nothing can justify what Billy's co-workers and family experienced, saw and felt on April 2nd, 2021, and every day since." After his death, Maisie had Noah's brain examined. It was recommended she do so by the FBI. The diagnosis came back: stage 1 CTE. What would you say to Officer William Evans' family, if you could?
Officer Evans should not have died that day. Noah should not have died that day. None of this should have occurred that day. But someone has to take the responsibility for telling parents what to do if something's just not quite right with those kids that are out there playing football for entertainment.
I travel from Virginia to Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a city forged from steel with a long history of producing great American footballers. It's also the site of the first National Sports Brain Bank.
Entire ventricle would be...
Dr. Julia Koffler is asking for former American footballers to agree to donate their brains for study.
Those are like fluid-filled spaces called the ventricles. When the brain is bounced around, the fluid is like sloshed around in kind of waves.
Dr. Koffler is looking for CTE by cutting cross-sections of the brain and later analysing it under the microscope. The disease can only be diagnosed after death. Over a period of years, scientists here are looking at brains to establish, among other things, whether some individuals are more prone to developing CTE than others and why that might be. Do you think there may be a link between CTE and violent crime?
It's really difficult to draw any conclusions about what motivates someone. We certainly know that neurodegenerative diseases can cause all sorts of different behavioral changes and changes in executive function and judgment. So it certainly could have contributed.
Top researchers revealing former NFL player Philip Adams had an unusually severe case of CTE when he went on a deadly rampage.
Former San Francisco 49ers star Philip Adams shot dead 6 people in an explosion of violence in 2021. He had severe CTE. Kellen Winslow, also a former NFL player, argued for his sentence for multiple rapes to be reduced because of what he says was head trauma suffered on the football field.
Now, poor Patrick got a lot of brain damage, I'm sure, that game.
Karen Ziegel is one of those fighting for more research. She lost her son Patrick, a university football star, to suicide aged 32. His post-mortem showed mild CTE.
We watched him over 10 years, sadly, lose himself. One time there was an incident with him, and he said a homeless guy attacked him in Pittsburgh, and he broke his hand punching this person. So, I mean, the rage was definitely scary.
Through her organisation, Stop CTE, Karen is campaigning for the brains of those who commit mass violence to be analysed for traumatic injury.
Every time we're looking at the symptoms of, you know, they lost their job, they broke up with their girlfriend. Everybody wants to know why. Why would someone take another person's life? If you've dealt with somebody whose brain became unwired, you see the lack of empathy. We're not going back to the root cause, which could be a damaged brain.
Concerns about brain injuries have contributed to the growth of flag football, a sport which means fewer big hits and less obvious danger. But the popularity of the NFL is enduring. This year's Super Bowl final was the most watched TV event in American history. But for its stars, the damage may already have been done. The human cost of the richest sport league in the world is far too difficult to count. Martha Kellner, Sky News.
Well, Sky News contacted the NFL for comment about our report. In response, the NFL provided details of the funding they're giving into CTE-related research, mental health support and the physical safety measures they say they're taking in the sport. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. After the break, Israel's warning to Hamas, return all the hostages or we enter Rafah. With the holy month of Ramadan looming and ceasefire negotiations stalling, is an Israeli ground offensive on the Gaza-Egyptian border region inevitable? Welcome back to The World with me, Yalda Hakim. More from my guests here in the studio, Dr. Miriam Francois, journalist and filmmaker, and Danielle Sheridan, defence editor at The Telegraph, in a moment. But next, though, let's talk about Gaza. Israel's war cabinet is threatening to invade Rafah, once thought to be the safest city in the Strip, where over 1 million displaced people are sheltering from war. The only thing that would stop an offensive, the safe return of all the hostages before the holy month of Ramadan, under 3 weeks away. From Jerusalem, here's our Middle East correspondent, Alistair Bunkle.
The Israeli military is steadily moving through the Gaza Strip, but the fight against Hamas is still intense. After 2 days of being denied entry, the World Health Organization evacuated critically ill patients out of Nasser Hospital in Khan Yunis, its medical center, the latest casualty in this war.
This is the former emergency department of Nasser Medical Complex. And it's a death zone.
As the bloody conflict continues, Israel's leaders are now turning their attention to Rafah, the last major urban area right on the Gaza-Egypt border. For the first time, a member of Israel's war cabinet has put a time frame on the ground operation.
If by Ramadan hostages are not home, the fighting will continue everywhere to include Rafah area.
More than 1 million civilians are now in Rafah, most of them having fled the fighting elsewhere in Gaza, and many living in tents, if they can find one, or out in the open if not. The situation is desperate.
We are becoming weak and my siblings are getting thinner. Before they were in better health, now life is destroyed.
There is growing international opposition to an Israeli ground offensive in Rafah without a plan to protect the civilians there. One option is to relocate Gazan civilians back to the north. But this is what it looks like there now, filmed by our team in recent days. Very few buildings have been left standing, and many people remain trapped under the rubble. Israel says it has no plans to force Gazans into Egypt, but a ground invasion of Rafah could cause chaos amongst already desperate people. Satellite images taken this month show massive construction on the Egyptian side of the border. Egypt says it won't allow Palestinians to be pushed south.
Israel says that it needs to enter Rafah if it is going to eliminate Hamas. They believe that many of the group's senior leaders are now hiding there. Some of the hostages could be held there, and they want to locate and destroy the tunnels that go into Egypt that have been used in the past to smuggle weapons to Hamas.
It's unclear whether Benny Gantz's warning of a Rafah offensive by Ramadan is official government policy or a ploy to put pressure on Hamas to agree a new hostage deal. It's also hard to see, though, how Israel could claim a victory over Hamas if it doesn't go into Rafah. Alistair Bunkle, Sky News, in Jerusalem.
Well, now from my interview with Nancy Pelosi, does she think the United States is applying enough pressure on Israel to prevent an operation into Rafah? The former Speaker of the House started by giving me her thoughts on Hamas's attack on October the 7th.
It was a horrible thing, and Israel has a right to defend itself and prepare to make sure that doesn't happen again. I'm very sad about the collateral damage in Gaza. So many people killed, so many innocent people, children and families. It is, they weren't combatants or anything, but they were collateral damage. And as long as Israel strives or does better to avoid that collateral damage, it will be a losing message for them, for their reputation. I think our administration, from what I can see, has been very clear in their message to Israel in terms of respecting the lives of all of those people. Also, to try to discourage them from what might come next in an attack. But Israel is their own country, and they do what they do. The person I admire the most there is President Herzog. I had it with Netanyahu years ago. I mean, really, not trying to make peace or anything all along. And I saw him here. I saw President Herzog here, and I said, how's it going?" And he said, we just have a little more to do, and we'll be there. So I was encouraged because he's a decent person. He's not a Netanyahu, and he said it that way. So let's have confidence that this will pass soon. Again, I always say everything is an opportunity, and maybe it'll be an opportunity for Israel to see the disfavor that many in the world had as to how they conducted themselves after October 7th, and will strive maybe for a two-state solution. I don't know, it's going to be hard. It's even harder now unless Hamas is gone.
Nancy Pelosi there. Well, as attention turns to what Israel's endgame is in this war, one neighbouring country has had a big hand to play in talks and attempting to drive diplomacy: Egypt. I asked the country's foreign minister whether things were heading in the wrong direction.
Well, what is happening in itself is an escalation of the situation related to what's happening in Gaza. We've seen the attack on the U.S. presence in Jordan. We've seen the consequences on the freedom of navigation in the Red Sea, the escalation on the Lebanese-Israeli borders. And there's always a possibility by virtue of mistakes that can happen, or by a widening and intensification of military activity that can put the whole region in a cycle of increased violence. We warned early on that there's a potential, a very high potential for such an eventuality, and again, we fear that it might escalate.
Are you disappointed in the response and reaction of the United States?
I can say that I'm disappointed in the international community's overall response. There seems to be a lip service paid, but not an actual recognition and sufficient intervention to provide the safety for civilians in this very difficult situation.
That was Foreign Minister Shukri speaking to me over the weekend. Let's bring in Miriam Francois and Danielle Sheridan. Miriam, when I spoke there to Sameh Shukri, the Egyptian Foreign Minister, he said, for us, it's a red line if Palestinians are pushed across the Rafah border into Egypt.
Oh, yeah, it's not just a matter of opinion, but I also just want to come back to this idea that, Netanyahu somehow can sort of say if the hostages aren't released by Ramadan. I mean, there was a deal on the table. Hamas had offered a deal that was being brokered in Cairo, by the Qataris, of all the hostages being released, starting with women and children, in exchange for the release of all the Palestinian hostages, that are 6,000 of whom from the West Bank and a large number also now from Gaza, including many children. And of course, you will know there was a UN report out just today highlighting the sexual abuse of women in detention, which follows another report highlighting the abuse of children in detention, including sexual abuse of children in detention. So yes, the priority should absolutely be on the return of hostages, but the problem is that there's no partner for peace in Israel. We have in Israel currently an extremist cabinet led by Netanyahu, but of course he only remains in power through the support of a far-right extremist cabinet that essentially is pushing the policies that we're seeing today. And Netanyahu cannot relinquish on those policies, because if he does, he will lose his position of power and he will end up in prison, because he's due on corruption charges 10 years worth of prison.
Is there a partner for peace for the Israelis, though? There's a lot of questions around revitalizing the PA, and trying to revitalize the two-state solution. And Israel would say, well, they don't have the right partners either.
I mean, to me, it feels like Israel is alone in this. Whilst it has the support of the US, Biden is trying to bring Netanyahu to the table and I feel almost offering him a way out, saying that this idea of going into Rafah isn't the only option. No one wants to see that if there can be a way without further destruction. It simply, with the amount of people currently stranded there, isn't going to be possible to do this in a civilised manner. So I don't think that he is acting with friends at the moment, and those people that are trying to provide some sort of friendship, if you will, he is ignoring their advice. So I'm not entirely sure what will happen come this idea of Ramadan being the break point, but also this red line for Egypt. What does a red line mean? Does it mean that they'll retaliate with force? I'm not clear on what could come next.
That's what he couldn't make clear. I asked him on the red line and what that meant.
I think on this issue, we need obviously a partner for peace on the Israeli side. And you mentioned the PA. Today we heard from Knesset members that they are going to unilaterally disband the Oslo agreements, as if Israel can sort of unilaterally decide that there's not going to be a Palestinian state. Well, let's be absolutely clear. Without a Palestinian state, there can be no safety or security in the region. The reason we're in this situation is because there has been a denial for the last 75 years of the Palestinian right to self-determination. We would do well to look at the ICJ today, which reminded us all of the framework of international law, which is that Israel must return to the 1967 borders, and we need to be able to restart a peace process based on the idea of two states. And without that, we are not going to see peace in the region, and we cannot be dragged into further war by these extremists. They must be reined in.
Miriam Francois, Danielle Sheridan, thank you both for joining us here on the programme. This is The World with me, Yalda Hakim. Next up, I'm joined by the actor Jodie Foster.
When you cover big, tense protests, there's almost always a moment when the atmosphere changes. There's a different noise, and you start to smell tear gas in the air.
As a team, we've interviewed some of the biggest stars in the world. Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt. It can be incredibly surreal being swept up in their world, but we try to give you an honest sense of how these people really are.
When we spoke to the fishermen down in Cornwall, all the politics from Westminster was a million miles away. This was about their jobs, their livelihoods.
Dowd, and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent. We can reveal that the driver who hit Harry Dunn is 42-year-old Anne Sakoulas.
Just met the president and we never thought we'd get this far.
This is what they're up against, is back-breaking work. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
It's really scary.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID. Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
Welcome back. 58 years into her career, and actor Jodie Foster is not slowing down. Nominated for Best Supporting Actress at this year's Oscars, she's also the star of the new season of True Detective. The final episode airs tonight in the UK. I sat down with Jodie to talk about the series and being a leading woman in Hollywood. She started by telling me how this season was so different from the rest. Have a listen.
The first season was Louisiana and hot and steamy and lots of bright light. You know, ours is the opposite. So cold Alaska, the long winter, and everything that comes with that. The kind of feeling, the tone that comes from that place, the particularly female story told by an Indigenous woman.
Was one of the reasons, you know, the fact that...
Absolutely. I think, well, first of all, the script was just amazing. So there's that. I think that was an immediate yes. But there is something to be said about, you know, when you talk about Native American history, the kind of, you know, generational genocide and all of that is sort of almost like baked into the permafrost there. There's something about that really gives rise to this almost paranormal horror genre and also this very deep feeling show.
If you look at the industry as a whole, in many ways we've often seen Hollywood dehumanize a lot of people, minority groups, communities. Do you feel we've come a long way?
Oh, yeah. I think that, you know, this year has been very exciting in terms of Indigenous representation, but, you know, representation is just a small part of it. And you want to, it's very important to center those stories with Indigenous voices. And, you know, in my case, playing Liz Danvers, it's not my story. It's Kaylee Reese's story. So it's the story of this Indigenous trooper whose destiny it is in some ways to get justice for these women that murdered and missing, abducted Indigenous women.
Well, if we then talk about film and how far things have come from when you were first nominated for an Academy Award in 1976 for Taxi Driver.
Right.
You know, I mean...
You've come a long way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true. You know, it's a lot of time. I've been in the business for 58 years. So when I first started in the 60s, I never saw another woman, for example. And now, really just recently for the United States, you know, women directors. That was the last bastion of change where we now have more women directors and everybody's happier.
If we talk a little bit more about the series, the show, you know, and the fact that, you know, playing a badass female detective, you know, we often see that role played by men, you know, and how was that for you? Because it is a complex character as well.
Yeah, I like to play complex characters, and I think that's the difference. It's always so funny, I do get that question about, like, isn't it amazing that there are two women at the helm of this show? And I'm like, not really that amazing, is it? I mean, I'm a female actress. I've been playing nothing but strong women my whole life, and so for me, I guess it's just not that strange. But I think what is wonderful and subversive about it is that we do have fully fleshed, super complicated characters that are extremely flawed. The world of complexity hasn't always been reserved for women, you know. We were the mother of, the sister of, the prostitute of, you know. It has taken a lot of work by women to flesh out female characters in the industry over time.
Jodie Foster, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
That was Jodie Foster there. Well, that's all for tonight's programme, which started with the question of how Alexei Navalny's legacy would live on. His widow has vowed to carry on his work, but will Vladimir Putin take note? Thanks for watching. We're back tomorrow at 9 p.m. News at 10 is next. Good night.